Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Jessie Ware record, That Feels Good. Going from a semi-alternative choice for a straightforward R&B slash pop fusion artist to becoming one of the most beloved pop musicians across the entirety of the international recording industry, Jessie Ware has had a pretty interesting career that's faced virtually nothing but an uphill trajectory over the course of the past few years at this point. 2020's What's Your Pleasure was unquestionably one of the best albums of its given year across the board. No genres needed to be added into that conversation. And any sort of follow up, considering the massive amount of critical acclaim the aforementioned album got, was going to be something that got a lot of anticipation put ahead of it, even if it wasn't meant to really be anything particularly grandiose, even if it was just an EP. Something to follow up What's Your Pleasure was going to have a huge amount of hype behind it no matter what. That Feels Good only managed to continue to ramp up its own level of hype by releasing some extraordinarily well received singles after a several year period of silence from Ware, and although it may not be as consistently amazing as its predecessor, That Feels Good is still another piece of evidence to make a solid, very firm case that Jessie Ware is one of the greatest, or at the very least, one of the most distinct pop stars active on the planet right now. Jessie Ware herself has been pretty much a raging fireball of charisma for multiple years at this point, which is something that she hugely demonstrates throughout the entirety of That Feels Good. As in a relatively brief 40-minute runtime, she demonstrates a number of emotions and tones, all of which are equally well executed and all of which feel genuine. Tracks like Free Yourself see Jessie sounding more independent and free sounding than she ever has before, while other cuts like Freak Me Now find her at her most directly flirty. But the important part here is that none of these emotions ever feel particularly false or drummed up by either herself or maybe her label for the sake of adding versatility to the record as a whole or something like that. It's a relatively short, average length, if you will, album that manages to demonstrate a number of feelings that are all real. From the explosive sensuality of the album opening title track to some of the more sensitive personalizations of songs like Hello Love, it really does feel like That Feels Good is more so Jessie Ware exploring every single side of the public persona that she has based her music around at this point. It's definitely something that demonstrates the fact that she is much more than a one-dimensional figure. She has many dimensions and she manages to show them off here in full. Ware is perhaps the definitive example in 2023, at the very least, of a pop star that can majorly stick to a singular vibe and atmosphere while still developing a record over the course of any given runtime with a form that is anything but flat or one note. She's an incredibly powerful, striking, and aesthetically diverse artist that still manages to stick to any given roots that she chooses to plant, meaning that an album like this, for example, will feel completely finished. It will feel full, it will feel rooted and grounded, while still managing to demonstrate a number of different qualities within her as an artist. The fact that Jessie Ware's vocal work strikes this perfect balance between diva-esque range and just straightforward meat and potatoes natural energy only adds to the straight success that the majority of this album faces, and the majority of her career over the past few years has faced at this point. With all of that being said, That Feels Good isn't more of the exact same after the extremely well-received What's Your Pleasure, which is nice to see, because considering the commercial as well as critical success of that aforementioned album, she easily just could have rinsed and repeated it and probably met the same amount of success, at least critically and commercially, than she would have with a new-ish direction throughout the entirety of this record. But instead, she chooses to change things up a little bit, and honestly, it's for the better. Whereas What's Your Pleasure saw Jessie more so break away from an adult contemporary adjacent, somewhat worn out R&B sounds to create something striking in a fresh, modernized take on classic disco, the entirety of That Feels Good is a bit more raw in nature, with a lot of the record really gripping on to some classic funk influences and more directly accepting disco sounds rather than just straight up modernizing them. The album still manages to maintain most of the more lush qualities of its predecessor, and generally speaking, this may not be the most unpredictable artistic change-up, if you can even really call it a change-up. in the history of music or anything like that, because, I mean, it's pretty predictable. It's fairly expected, especially if you've really been focusing in on the creative evolution of Jessie as an artist up to this point, but nonetheless, it's something that makes sense, and it's something that suits her as a musician, as a performer, as a lyricist, and generally just as an individual. If anything, the sort of thin line that she walks between mildly experimental dance pop and just straight up disco influenced modern day pop music is something that makes her a pretty intriguing figure, even if she's not necessarily enigmatic or anything like that per se. The largely successful execution of some of the more energetic, upbeat tracks here, such as the excellent album closer These Lips, is somewhat reliant on the contributions of James Ford and Stuart Price, the two primary producers behind the album, but more importantly than that, two individuals that contribute bass, keyboard, guitar work, among many other instruments that really define the really classic funk-esque kind of sound throughout the entirety of this record. Without their instrumental contributions, I would argue that some of the aesthetics here would be partially lost. That isn't to say that this is Price and Ford's album per se. Jessie Ware is the one that really does steal the show with her general performances. That should go without saying, but nonetheless, the two producers behind this record are fairly integral instrumentalists as well, and their names should not go without mention. Some of the more laid-back and smoother moments here are also definitely highlighted by a sort of slick, chill production style that once again is delivered both by primarily Ford and Price, so they are integral to the development of the record as a whole, and generally speaking, Jessie Ware, James Ford, and Stuart Price are practically the dream team, the dream trio, if you will, of this kind of brand of pop music. They really do manage to deliver an excellent follow-up to the meteoric arrival of What's Your Pleasure, with a sound that not only suits Jessie Ware, but also suits the modern-day pop landscape, while still injecting arguably some degree of new life into a certain niche of modern pop. Sure, you could say that this album is a bit expected because of the fact that 70s and 80s brands of pop revivalism has definitely been going on for several years at this point, see artists like Dua Lipa, but nonetheless, that's not inherently a bad thing, as this record really does manage to execute that particular sound with a fairly different vibe as a whole that just feels a touch more raw and maybe a bit more honest than many of her peers. In general, That Feels Good is shockingly perfect, and I say perfect in quotations because there are flaws here that do arguably drag down the album at several points throughout the entirety of the listening experience, but at the same time, these flaws aren't particularly major, and if you aren't someone that really cares about semi-small details, you probably won't notice them. For example, the tracks Pearl and Lightning are two songs that are just relatively strong, good pop songs that don't necessarily match up to the quality of the rest of the track list. In fact, they downright pale in comparison to a number of the real highlights here, and as a whole, they just don't feel like they're really on par with what Jessie Ware is mostly doing at this point. There's also the fact that These Lips, which is easily one of the best songs on the entirety of That Feels Good, and arguably one of the best songs that Jessie Ware has ever done, is not really the best album closer in the world. I mean, it's a great song, of course, that should go without saying, considering the fact that I just cited it as one of her best tracks to date, but really as something to wrap up the record, to really put a bow on That Feels Good, it just doesn't totally fit, and I feel as though there maybe should have been an extra track or two to really close this record out, as it doesn't feel like anything here is something that suits itself as an album closer, even though the album as a whole does feel relatively fleshed out and finished. With that in mind, there aren't any true lulls in quality throughout the entirety of That Feels Good, if I'm being totally honest, and really there are just songs that happen to be so good that they make other tracks look weak by comparison, when the truth is that the highlights here are downright amazing, and the quote-unquote lowlights here are just really good tracks. It's more so just a matter of That Feels Good being an ever so slight decline in the matter of consistency and general sturdiness in the context of Jessie Ware's discography, and considering the fact that her last album was, again, one of the best albums of 2020 and one of the best albums that we've seen this decade thus far, I think it goes without saying that it's pretty hard to match that level of quality a second time in a row. To be totally realistic, the notion to create another album that managed to match up with the relentless consistency of What's Your Pleasure 3 years ago just wasn't very likely. It's not necessarily that it's impossible, but at the same time, it's just a record that really did manage to make massive waves within the realm of pop music as a whole, and for understandable reasons, meaning that it's a record that's hard to follow up with something directly of equal consistency, quality, and with highlights that shine as bright. That being said, That Feels Good is still an album that's worthy of your admiration as an album as a whole. It's still very consistent, it's more than solid, in fact, it's pretty fantastic, with its best moments being major highlights in Jessie Ware's career up to this point. The entire record sort of mixes together a bit of rawness with the best qualities of modern day pop music to make something that feels just as forward thinking in the context of mainstream music as it does nostalgia bait in the best possible way that it could. And needless to say, That Feels Good feels pretty great. You see what I did there? Because it's like the album title. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.